The conference room at Holloway Precision Manufacturing smells like burnt coffee and dry erase marker, and on the last Thursday in April, that's the smell Gary Holloway will remember whenever he thinks back on the morning everything came apart at once. The auditor's name was Richard Voss, a senior manager from a regional accounting firm out of Cleveland, sent to run a standard financial audit ahead of a refinancing package with First Merit Community Bank. He was maybe 60, gray at the temples, the kind of man who wore the same navy suit 3 days running and didn't seem to notice or care. He'd been in the conference room since 8 that morning with 2 associates, a laptop, and 4 bankers' boxes of files that Gary's office manager had pulled together the week before. At 10:40, Voss closed a folder. He did it quietly, no theatrics, just closed it and set it down flat on the table and folded his hands on top of it, the way a man does when he's about to say something he's already decided he's going to say, regardless of how the room reacts. "Who maintained these records before 2022?" he asked. Nobody answered. Frank Delgado, the plant manager, looked at Courtney, the bookkeeper who'd been hired 18 months earlier. Courtney looked at Gary. Gary looked at the folder like it might explain itself if he stared at it long enough. "There's a gap," Voss said, when the silence had gone on a beat too long to be comfortable. "Vendor reconciliations, the ISO compliance files, the supplier correspondence. Everything before spring of last year is thin. Some of it's missing entirely. I've got purchase orders with no matching receiving documentation going back to 2019. I've got a supplier dispute file from 2017 that references a settlement letter I don't have a copy of. Whoever built this filing system knew what they were doing, and then at some point, it looks like they stopped." Gary cleared his throat and said something about a system migration, a server issue. The kind of vague, technical explanation people reach for when they don't actually know the answer. Voss nodded slowly, the nod of a man taking notes in his head rather than agreeing with anything, and wrote something on his legal pad. Frank, sitting 2 seats down, didn't say what he was thinking, which was that he knew exactly whose filing system that was, and exactly when it had stopped, and exactly why. He'd known Diane Holloway for 19 years. He wasn't about to say her name out loud in that room, not with Gary sitting right there, not with the divorce barely 5 months final, but he thought it. To understand how a folder full of missing paperwork can bring a manufacturing company to its knees, you have to go back to a Sunday afternoon in 1997 in a rented storefront that used to be a hardware store where Gary Holloway and his father-in-law had set up 2 second-hand CNC lathes and a single computer running an accounting program neither of them fully understood. Diane wasn't part of the business plan. She'd married Gary 2 years earlier, was working as a claims processor for an insurance company in Erie, and had exactly zero background in manufacturing or bookkeeping beyond what she'd absorbed watching her own father run a small electrical contracting business growing up. But Gary's father-in-law, her own father technically, since it was her dad who'd put up the seed money, was 71 and starting to have good days and bad days, and somebody needed to make sense of the invoices piling up in a cardboard box behind the front counter. Diane started coming in on Saturdays. "I figured I'd get it organized and hand it off to whoever they hired," she has said more than once describing those early years. "That was the plan. There was never a plan for it to be me." Except nobody got hired because the company couldn't afford to hire anyone for years, and Diane, without exactly deciding to, became the person who understood where all the money went. She built the first real chart of accounts the company ever had, using a library book on small business bookkeeping and a lot of trial and error. She was the one who figured out, in 2001, that a supplier had been overbilling them on tooling costs for the better part of a year, a discovery that came from nothing more sophisticated than her habit of comparing every invoice against the original quote, a habit nobody had asked her to develop, and that saved the company almost $11,000 that year alone. Real money for a business that size at the time. She never took a salary from Holloway Precision until 2006, and even then it was modest, because the money mostly went back into the machines. She kept her insurance job the first several years, doing the company's books at night at the kitchen table, the same unglamorous arrangement that a lot of small manufacturing companies are quietly built on. A spouse doing two jobs so the business can survive its own infancy. By the time their son Nathan was born in 1999 and their daughter Sarah in 2002, Diane had stopped thinking of the bookkeeping as a temporary favor and started thinking of it as simply one of her jobs alongside being a mother and, eventually, alongside a part-time role helping manage vendor relationships that had grown out of the same instinct that caught the tooling over billing. She noticed things. She followed up on things. She was the person who called a supplier back the same day instead of letting it sit for a week. The company grew slowly and then, in the mid-2000s, less slowly. Holloway Precision picked up a contract supplying machined components to a Tier 2 automotive supplier outside Toledo, then a second contract with a hydraulics manufacturer, and by 2007 they had 31 employees and a building of their own, purchased with an SBA loan that Diane had assembled the application for, line by line, over a 6-week stretch that she remembers mostly through the lens of how many nights she fell asleep at the kitchen table with a calculator still in her hand. Then came 2008. Anybody who ran a manufacturing business through the recession that started that fall has their own version of this part of the story, and Holloway Precision's version was not unique, which somehow makes it worse rather than better, because it means the company's near collapse wasn't some freak event. It was just what happened to a lot of small suppliers when their customers' stopped buying trucks and machinery, and the orders dried up 2 steps removed from anything Gary or Diane had done wrong. By early 2009, Holloway Precision was 3 weeks from being unable to make payroll. Gary has said, in calmer years since, that he remembers standing in the plant looking at machines that were mostly sitting idle and feeling something close to physical illness, a kind of dread he'd never experienced before, and didn't have any tools for handling. Diane is the one who kept the company alive that year, and this isn't a matter of family mythology or a wife's exaggerated memory. It shows up in the company's own surviving records, in emails, in the recollections of people who were there, in the fact that Frank Delgado, hired as a machinist that same year and promoted eventually to plant manager, still brings it up unprompted when people ask him how long he's worked there. She went through every vendor contract line by line and found 2 suppliers who were overcharging on freight, small amounts individually, but real money added up over a year. She discovered that the company's insurance broker had them enrolled in a workers' comp classification that was more expensive than it needed to be, a correction that saved almost $6,000 annually going forward. She rebuilt the company's entire accounts receivable aging report, which had been maintained inconsistently, and used it to have honest, difficult conversations with 2 customers who were 60 and 90 days past due. Conversations Gary didn't have the stomach for that year. Conversations that recovered close to $40,000 the company badly needed. Most critically, she's the one who sat across the desk from the loan officer at their bank, not Gary, Diane, and walked him through a cash flow projection she'd built herself, month by month, showing exactly how the company would recover if the bank extended their credit line rather than calling the loan. She'd spent 3 straight nights building that projection, and when she presented it, The loan officer, a man named Kurt Halverson, who'd later leave banking for a job at a credit union, told her it was the most thorough projection he'd seen from a company that size all year. He extended the line. Holloway Precision survived. Gary was in some of those meetings. In others, he wasn't because he was on the plant floor trying to keep morale up among the workers who were watching their hours get cut, which was also real and necessary work, the kind of thing a good owner does. Nobody is claiming Gary did nothing during those years. What's true, and what took a long time to become visible to anyone outside the family, is that the specific work of keeping the company financially alive, the paperwork, the negotiations, the relationships, the discipline of it, ran almost entirely through Diane, and that Gary, in the years afterward, slowly stopped remembering that part accurately. It's a common enough pattern that it barely needs explaining, and yet it's strange to watch happen to someone you love. Success came back to Holloway Precision by 2013, steadily, then more than steadily. New customers, a second building, 48 employees by 2018, a reputation in the region as a reliable precision shop that could handle tight tolerances other shops turned down. And as the success grew, so did the story Gary told about it, first to customers, then to his own family, then eventually, it seemed, to himself. He started saying things at industry dinners like, "We clawed our way back in '09 through sheer stubbornness," a true sentence that somehow left Diane's name out of it entirely, not through malice, more through the ordinary human tendency to become the hero of your own retelling. He'd mentioned sometimes that Diane helps out with some of the office stuff, a description that had been roughly accurate around 2001 and had been wildly inadequate for at least 15 years by the time he was still using it in 2019. Diane, for her part, didn't correct him. Not really. Not in any sustained way. She'd bring it up occasionally, lightly, the way people do when they want to register a complaint without actually starting a fight. "I did a little more than help out, Gary." And Gary would laugh and agree and move the conversation along, and Diane would let it move along because she has said honestly when asked about it later that she'd made a kind of peace with the arrangement a long time ago. The business was healthy, the kids were healthy. Correcting the record in front of a room of suppliers at a Christmas party felt to her like it would cost more than it was worth. "I told myself the work mattered more than who got credit for it," she said once to her sister-in-law, Gary's own sister Pam, of all people, in a conversation that happened well after everything had already fallen apart. I actually believed that for a long time. I'm not sure anymore that it's entirely true, or maybe it's true but incomplete. The work mattering doesn't mean the credit doesn't matter too. I just didn't want to fight about it. The company's growth after 2013 also meant, gradually, that Diane's hands-on role changed shape without shrinking in importance. She hired Courtney in 2018 to handle day-to-day bookkeeping, a decision Diane made because the company had genuinely outgrown a single person doing it at a kitchen table. But Diane kept the compliance files, the vendor relationship history, the archived correspondence, and the deep institutional memory of the business largely with herself, partly because it had always been that way, and partly, if she's honest, because some of it lived on her own home computer and in her own filing cabinet in the spare bedroom that had functioned as her office since before the company had an office of its own. This detail matters, and it's worth being precise about it, because it becomes the center of everything that happens later. Nothing about this arrangement was secretive or improper. Diane had been doing bookkeeping and compliance work for the company from home since 1997, long before there was a company office to do it in. And when the company did get an office, a lot of the historical archives simply never got physically migrated because nobody ever asked her to migrate it, and she never thought to volunteer because in her mind it was simply where her files lived, the way anyone's files live wherever they've always lived. She had years of vendor correspondence, historical compliance documentation, and internal financial reconciliations on a password-protected external drive at home, alongside physical folders in a locked cabinet, all of it legally hers to maintain, in the sense that she'd created almost all of it herself, on her own equipment, as an owner's spouse doing legitimate, if informally arranged work for a family business that never got around to formalizing its record-keeping the way a larger, more bureaucratic company might have. Gary knew, in a vague way, that Diane kept files at home. He'd known it for over 20 years. It had simply never occurred to him, until it mattered enormously, that Diane keeps files at home, and the company's institutional memory lives partly outside the building, were the same fact described two different ways. The marriage had been quietly deteriorating for something like 3 years before the divorce filing, in ways that Diane, again with the benefit of hindsight, has described as gradual enough that she kept mistaking each individual moment for something survivable. Gary had grown more impatient, more prone to talking over her in meetings that included both of them, more likely to describe decisions as his own even when they'd been made jointly at the kitchen table the night before. There was no affair, no dramatic betrayal in the conventional sense, which in some ways made it harder for people around them to understand what had gone wrong. Gary would have said, if you'd asked him in 2021, that the marriage was fine, a little stale maybe, the way marriages get after 25 years, nothing alarming. What Gary was actually experiencing, though he wouldn't have described it this way at the time, was a kind of narrowing. Success had given him a story about himself, self-made, tough, the guy who clawed the company back from the brink through will alone. And that story had become more important to him than the more complicated, less flattering, but truer story that involved his wife's spreadsheets and phone calls, and 3 sleepless nights building a cash flow projection. Believing the simpler story made him feel good. He didn't examine for a long time what believing it was costing the person who'd actually made it possible for him to still be in business. He filed for divorce in November, 3 years after the strain had started showing, following a period that both of them, separately, would later describe as the worst 18 months of the marriage. Arguments that flared up over small things and never actually resolved the large thing underneath them. A distance at the dinner table. Sarah, their daughter, home from college for a weekend and asking Diane afterward in the car, "Is everything okay with you and Dad?" in a tone that suggested she already suspected the answer. The filing itself came without the kind of confrontation you might expect. Gary had a lawyer, a courteous but businesslike man named Philip Rourke, send the paperwork to the house while Diane was at her sister's for the weekend, and Diane found out from a certified letter rather than a conversation, which she has said, of everything that happened that year, was among the things that hurt in the most specific and lingering way. Not the divorce itself, which she'd half expected by then, but the logistics of how she learned about it. 29 years, she told her sister-in-law Pam, and he couldn't sit across the table and tell me himself. Gary, for his part, has said since Tao, in one of the more honest conversations he and Diane eventually had, long after the worst of it, that he avoided telling her directly because he genuinely couldn't figure out how to say it out loud without having to explain the reasons, and he wasn't ready yet to hear himself say the reasons, because some of them, when he tried to form them into sentences, sounded thin even to him. What he did say to other people in the weeks after the filing was less careful. To his sister Pam, at a family gathering that Diane wasn't at, he said something like, "The company's in a good place now. It doesn't need the 2 of us the way it used to." To Frank Delgado, in a conversation on the plant floor that Frank has recounted more than once since, Gary said almost defensively, unprompted, "Diane's not involved in the business side of things anymore, just so you know, in case people ask." Frank had found the comment strange at the time, mostly because, as far as he knew, Diane was still handling half the compliance calls that came into the office. But he didn't say anything because it wasn't his place, and because he assumed, as most people around the company assumed, that whatever arrangement was being worked out in the divorce would sort out the business details in some orderly way behind the scenes. It didn't particularly sort out in an orderly way. The divorce settlement finalized the following April after a mediation process that Diane found exhausting in a low-grade, grinding way rather than a dramatic one, gave Diane a settlement that reflected her non-owner status on paper. She'd never taken an equity stake in Holloway Precision, a decision made in the early 2000s for reasons that had made sense to both of them at the time and that Diane now recognizes. With some bitterness, she's tried not to let curdle into something worse, as one of the costlier decisions of her life. She got a portion of the house equity, a negotiated cash settlement, and no ongoing role at the company, which both lawyers treated as a straightforward matter since Diane wasn't a formal employee and had no title, no contract, nothing on paper that reflected almost 3 decades of work. She'd moved out of the house by January into a rented condo across town, closer to Sarah's old high school than anything else. Mostly because the rental had come up fast and she hadn't wanted to spend the winter in a hotel. She kept, in the move, the same external hard drive and the same 2 filing cabinets she'd kept for years, because nobody asked for them, because nobody at the company had ever fully understood what was in them, and because, she has said this plainly when asked, it genuinely did not occur to her in the fog of that winter that anyone would need to ask. Gary, in those same months, was riding a kind of high that people around him mistook for confidence, and that Frank Delgado, watching from the plant floor, privately worried was something closer to denial. Gary told a regional business magazine in a short profile that ran in February that Holloway Precision had come through some personal changes at the ownership level, but remained as strong as ever, built on the systems and discipline we established over 25 years. A quote that made Diane's jaw tighten when Pam forwarded it to her, not because it was cruel exactly, but because the word "we" in that sentence no longer seemed to include her and Gary's own mind, even though the systems in question were substantially hers. The bank refinancing that triggered Richard Voss's audit had been in motion since the previous autumn, part of a plan Gary had to expand the plant's capacity with a new line of 5-axis machining equipment, a genuinely sound business decision that required a larger credit facility than the company's existing bank was comfortable extending without a full external audit first. Standard practice for a loan of that size. The audit had been scheduled for months. Nobody thought much about it going in, because Holloway Precision had always passed its periodic reviews without much drama, back when Diane was quietly making sure every reconciliation was clean before anyone from outside ever looked at it. Which brings the story back to that Thursday morning in the conference room, Richard Voss with his folder closed on the table, asking a question nobody wanted to answer. The days that followed were not dramatic in the way a courtroom scene is dramatic. They were dramatic the way a slow leak is dramatic, a series of small mounting inconveniences that individually looked manageable and collectively amounted to a serious problem. Voss needed the 2017 supplier settlement letter, the one that resolved a dispute with a tooling vendor over a batch of defective carbide inserts, because the bank's underwriters wanted to confirm the company had no unresolved liability from that dispute. Nobody in the office could locate it. Courtney searched the shared drive for 2 full days. Frank remembered the dispute vaguely. He'd been on the floor when the bad inserts came in and had to scrap a full production run. But he didn't know where the paperwork had ended up because it hadn't been his job to track it. It had been Diane's. Voss needed the ISO 9001 compliance documentation from 2019 and 2020, records that were required for a customer certification renewal that was, as it happened, also coming due that same quarter. A coincidence that made the missing paperwork considerably more urgent than it might otherwise have been. The company's quality manager, a soft-spoken man named Aaron Petrocelli, who'd been hired in 2020 and had never worked directly with Diane, discovered that half the internal audit logs from before his tenure simply weren't where the compliance manual said they should be. Voss needed vendor correspondence establishing the terms of an informal rebate arrangement with one of the company's largest raw material suppliers, an arrangement that had never been written into a formal contract, existing instead as an understanding built over years of relationship and confirmed periodically by emails that lived in an account Diane had used for years to handle vendor relations. An account that had, in the confusion of the divorce and the following months, simply been deactivated by IT as part of routine housekeeping when nobody flagged it as still relevant. By the second week of the audit, Gary had started fielding calls directly from suppliers who, when the company's staff couldn't answer their questions about historical terms or long-standing arrangements, had started asking, with increasing bluntness, to just talk to Diane. The first of these calls came from a fastener supplier in Sandusky, a man named Ron Kaczmarek who'd been doing business with Holloway Precision since 2004 and who called the main office line asking about a volume discount tier that Courtney couldn't find any documentation for. Diane set that up with me personally, must be 6-7 years ago now, Ron told Courtney. Not unkindly, just matter of fact. Handshake and an email, but it's real. We've been honoring it every quarter since. She'd know exactly where the email is. Can you just have her call me? Courtney, new enough to the company and uncomfortable enough with the whole situation, brought the question to Gary rather than trying to explain the divorce to a supplier over the phone. Gary told her to just honor whatever discount the supplier claimed, which solved that particular problem but did nothing for the 11 similar calls that came in over the following month, each one requiring either an uncomfortable conversation about why Diane wasn't available or an improvised solution that cost the company more than the paperwork, properly filed, would have. The most serious problem turned out to be the missing 2017 settlement letter, because without it, the bank's underwriting team flagged the tooling vendor dispute as an open contingent liability, which in turn slowed the refinancing approval by nearly 6 weeks, while the company scrambled to reconstruct what had actually been agreed. A process that involved Voss's team contacting the tooling vendor directly, which the vendor's own accounts payable department found somewhat alarming, given that as far as they were concerned, the matter had been closed for years. Frank Delgado, watching all of this unfold from the plant floor, reached a point in early May where he decided, against his own general instinct to stay out of family business, to say something to Gary directly. They were standing by the loading dock, waiting on a delayed delivery. And Frank, who doesn't waste words, said it plainly. "You know all this stuff the auditor's asking about? It's stuff Diane used to keep. I'm not trying to get in your business, Gary, but half the guys in that office have called me this month asking where something is, and my answer every time is the same. Diane would know." Gary didn't respond right away. Frank has said, describing the moment later, that Gary looked less angry than tired, the specific tiredness of a man doing arithmetic he'd been avoiding for a long time. "I know," Gary said finally. "I know, Frank." It took another 2 weeks, and a genuinely uncomfortable meeting with Richard Voss, in which Gary had to admit, in front of 2 associates and his own plant manager, that a substantial portion of the company's historical documentation had, for as long as anyone could determine, lived primarily with his ex-wife before Gary called Diane directly for the first time since the settlement had finalized. She let it ring twice before answering. She has said, describing that moment later to Pam, that she felt something oddly calm in herself. Not triumphant, not vindictive, more like the stillness of a person who has been quietly expecting a particular knock at the door for a long time and finally hears it. "Diane, it's Gary." A pause. "We've got an audit going on. The bank's doing a full review before the refinancing goes through, and there's a lot of old paperwork they're asking for that nobody here can find. I think it might be with you. At the house. I mean at your place." "Some of it, probably," Diane said. "I kept my own files the whole time I worked there, Gary. You know that." "I do," Gary said, and there was another pause. Longer this time. "I need to ask you for help. I know how that sounds, given everything. I'm asking anyway." Diane didn't answer right away either. She was sitting in the condo's small kitchen, a room she'd come to like more than she expected to, a window over the sink that got good morning light, and she has said she thought, in that pause, about a lot of things at once. The certified letter, the magazine quote, the Christmas parties where Gary said she helped out with the office stuff, and also, underneath all of that, 29 years of a life that had genuinely had good parts in it too, parts she didn't want to pretend away just because the ending had gone the way it went. "I'll talk to a lawyer before I agree to anything," she said. "I'm not trying to be difficult, Gary, but if the company wants my files or wants me consulting on this, that's not something I'm doing as a favor anymore. I did favors for 29 years. I'm not doing that again." Gary said that was fair. He said it quietly. And Diane has said that was the first time in longer than she could remember that he'd said anything to her without an edge of impatience underneath it. What followed was not a reconciliation, romantic or otherwise, and the story is better and truer for not pretending it was. Diane hired an attorney, a business lawyer named Renata Ibarra, who'd handled a few small consulting agreements for other clients in similar situations. And within about 10 days, Holloway Precision Manufacturing and Diane had a short-term consulting agreement, paid, with an hourly rate that made Gary's jaw tighten slightly when he saw it, though he didn't argue, because Richard Voss's audit had made the value of the missing work uncomfortably concrete by then, in a way no conversation ever could have. Diane spent 6 weeks, mostly from her own condo, some days at the office when documents needed to be physically compared against the plant's records, reconstructing what she could. She located the 2017 settlement letter within the first 2 days in a folder she'd labeled with the plain, unglamorous precision she'd always brought to the work. Tooling Disputes 2015 to 2019. She walked Aaron Petricelli through the missing compliance audit logs over 3 long afternoons, explaining not just where documents were, but why certain procedures had been set up the way they had. Institutional memory that turned out to matter as much as the paper itself. She had a phone call with Ron Kaczmarek that lasted 11 minutes and ended with him telling her, warmly, that he'd wondered when somebody would finally get around to calling. Richard Voss, over the course of those weeks, developed what Frank Delgado later described as a quiet, professional respect for Diane that showed up mostly in small observations rather than anything dramatic. He noted in a conversation with Gary near the end of the engagement that the historical filing system, wherever it had physically lived, was more rigorous than most he saw at companies twice Holloway Precision's size. He asked Diane at one point, almost as an aside, how she developed her method for organizing vendor disputes, and when she explained the library book and the trial and error and 19 years of just paying close attention, he said, in the understated way auditors say things that actually carry weight. That's not luck. That's discipline most people don't have. He never said anything to Gary directly about the marriage, and it wasn't his place to, and he didn't. But in his final report to the bank, in the section addressing remediation of the documentation gaps, he wrote a sentence that Gary read several times over, alone in his office after everyone else had gone home for the day. The company's historical record-keeping, prior to 2022, reflects a level of organizational discipline that appears to have been maintained by a single individual whose departure created a material gap in institutional knowledge. Remediation has depended substantially on that individual's continued cooperation. Gary didn't show that sentence to anyone. He kept the report in his desk for a while, and Diane found out about it only because Voss mentioned it to her directly, in an offhand, professional way, near the end of the engagement as a kind of compliment. "For what it's worth," he told her, closing his laptop after their last working session together. Most owners never find out what they had until it's gone. It's usually invisible right up until the day someone asks a question nobody can answer. Diane thanked him. She has said that comment stayed with her longer than almost anything Gary said during those 6 weeks, maybe because it came from someone with no stake in the marriage at all, someone whose only interest was in whether the numbers added up, which somehow made it land more honestly than anything from inside the family could have. The refinancing eventually went through, about 10 weeks later than originally planned, at terms slightly less favorable than the company would have gotten without the delay. A real cost, not a ruinous one, but real. Holloway Precision didn't collapse. It's still running. 40-some employees, the new machining line eventually installed. Business continuing in the unglamorous, grinding way manufacturing businesses continue when they're fundamentally sound. But something had changed inside the building that outlasted the audit itself. Employees who'd worked there for years started referring, without much comment, to the Diane years versus what came after, a distinction that wasn't unkind so much as simply accurate, a way of marking a period whose value had only become fully legible in its absence. Gary offered Diane an ongoing consulting retainer once the audit closed, a genuine offer, not a token one, and Diane thought about it for close to a month before declining, a decision she describes now as one of the clearer ones she's made in years. Not out of anger, though there was some of that still working its way through her system. Mostly because she'd realized, over those 6 weeks of being paid properly for work she'd once done for free, that she didn't want the next chapter of her life to be a better compensated version of the same chapter. She started her own small consulting practice that fall, working with a handful of family-owned manufacturing businesses in the region on exactly the kind of unglamorous back-office organization she'd taught herself out of a library book almost 30 years earlier. Compliance documentation, vendor relationship systems, the kind of institutional infrastructure that nobody notices until it's missing. Her first 2 clients came through referrals, one of them, without any apparent irony, a recommendation from Richard Voss himself, who'd mentioned her name to a small aerospace parts supplier in Youngstown that was struggling with an audit of its own. She rented a small office downtown the following spring. Nothing fancy. A converted storefront not unlike the one where Holloway Precision had started, and had her name put on the door in plain block letters. Diane Kowalski Consulting, using her maiden name for the business. A choice she made without much fanfare, mostly because it felt, she said, like starting a sentence over rather than finishing one that had already gone wrong. She and Gary settled over the following year into something neither of them would have predicted during the worst month of the divorce: a working civility, occasional calls about Nathan's or Sarah's lives, a shared appearance at Sarah's graduate school graduation the following spring, where they sat 2 seats apart and managed for a few hours to just be two parents proud of their daughter. Gary, at some point that day, standing near the punch bowl at the small reception afterward, told Diane quietly, without an audience, that he'd been wrong about a lot of things, and that he hoped the business she'd built was going well, and that he meant it as more than small talk. "It's going well," Diane said. "I like it more than I expected to. Turns out I like getting to put my own name on the door." Gary nodded and didn't say anything else about it, and Diane has said that was fine, that she didn't need him to say anything else, that the sentence had been enough on its own. There's a scene, almost a year after that conference room morning with Richard Voss's folder closed on the table, that Diane comes back to when people ask her how she thinks about all of it now. She was in her own small office on a Tuesday afternoon, going over a vendor compliance file for her second client, the aerospace parts supplier in Youngstown, and she noticed she'd fallen into the exact same rhythm she'd had at the kitchen table 30 years earlier, comparing an invoice against a quote, catching a discrepancy, making a note in the margin in her own small, careful handwriting. Nothing about the task itself had changed. What had changed was that her name was on the door, her rate was on the invoice, and nobody in that building was going to stand up at a Christmas party someday and describe what she did as helping out with the office stuff. She has said that recognizing that difference, sitting alone in an ordinary office on an ordinary Tuesday, felt less like triumph and more like something quieter and sturdier than that. Like finally exhaling after holding a position for a very long time. If you've ever watched someone's quiet, unglamorous work get taken for granted until the day it disappeared and everyone suddenly needed it back, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever been that person yourself, or watched it happen to someone close to you? What made people finally notice? If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more stories like it, and I'll see you in the next one.